In this lecture, we are going to discuss the birth of sociology. Sociology, as a scientific study of society, emerged in the 19th century in Western Europe that was marked by social anarchy and dissolution. Sociology emerged as a response to that kind of a situation. This context was marked by Enlightenment, Industrial and French revolutions. The Industrial and French revolutions led to the dissolution of the old order, and the Enlightenment had provided the intellectual background to the French Revolution. By upholding science as the only legitimate form of knowledge and the epitome of reason, and the scientific method to be valid not only for the natural sciences but one that could be employed for the study of society, Enlightenment led to a secularization of society and undermined the role of the church as the custodian of knowledge. The Industrial Revolution brought in the factory system and new forms of labor discipline, which had also been considered as that led to the dehumanization of the worker, and we could see the dehumanization not only in terms of the enslavement to the machine, but also in the living conditions of the worker. The anonymity and self-centered character of the industrial city and the radical transformation of property had all made the Industrial Revolution be considered as one of the most important factors that led to the old order being severely undermined. The French Revolution not only abolished the absolutist monarchy, but also the old social arrangements and institutions of family, marriage, education, property, and religion were radically transformed. Obviously, a reaction to this kind of a situation was expected, and we got that kind of reaction in the form of the conservative romantic reaction. The conservative romantic reaction had a great role to play in the birth of this new discipline, and as we shall see in this module, where we focus mostly on Saint-Simon, the impact it had on the rise of this new discipline. And so therefore, we are going to spend little more time on the conservative romantic reaction than we did with the Enlightenment and the two revolutions. This reaction laid the philosophical foundation to a new interest in social order. The interest in order and stability emerged in the context of anarchy, disorder, and the radical transformation of the medieval social order. The reaction traced 18th century anarchy and uprooting of man from his community through European history of modernism. It identified the Protestant Reformation, industrial capitalism, and science as the major forces that led to the weakening of the medieval order. The reaction wanted to bring back the old order that was dissipated. Now, what were the aspects of the reaction that were critical for the emergence of sociology? Erwin Zeitlin gives us those points. Society is an organic unity with internal laws of development and deep roots in the past, not simply a mechanical aggregate of individual elements. Society antedates the individual and is ethically superior to the individual. Humans have no existence outside of a social group or context, and they become human only by participating in society. We are going to see how these aspects of the reaction had the impact on sociology. We could easily see the kind of impact it had on, let's say, one of the greatest sociologists, Emile Durkheim. The individual, according to the reaction, is an abstraction and not the basic element of a society. Society is composed of relationships and institutions, and individuals are simply members of society who fulfill certain statuses and roles. The parts of a society are interdependent and interrelated. Sociology emerged with that kind of a holistic understanding of society, with interdependent and interrelated parts, and that the whole is superior to the summation of its parts. Customs, beliefs, and institutions are organically intertwined, so that changing or remaking one part will undermine the complex relationships maintaining the stability of society as a whole. Humans have constant and unalterable needs, which every society and each of its institutions serve to fulfill. Institutions are thus positive agencies by which basic human needs are met. If these agencies are disturbed or disrupted, there will be suffering and disorder. The various customs and institutions of a society are positively functional. They either fulfill human needs directly or indirectly by serving other indispensable institutions. Even prejudice is viewed in these terms. It tends to unify certain groups and also increases their sense of security. The existence and maintenance of small groups is essential to society. The family, neighborhood, province, religious groups, occupational groups are all basic units of a society, the basic supports of the lives of humans. The revolutions, as the reaction saw it, had led not to a higher form of organization, but to social and moral disintegration. They wanted to preserve, that is, the philosophers of the reaction, wanted to preserve the older religious forms, Catholicism, not Protestantism, and sought to restore the religious unity of medieval Europe. Protestantism, in teaching the importance of individual faith, had undermined the spiritual unity of society, and that is how the reaction saw Protestantism. The reaction further recognized the disorganizing consequences of industry, commerce, and urbanism. The reaction insisted on the essential importance and positive value of the non-rational aspects of human existence, such as ritual, ceremony, and worship. The Enlightenment, it claimed, in its merciless criticism of these activities as irrational vestiges of the past, had weakened the sacred supports of society. Finally, status and hierarchy were also treated as essential to society. The reaction feared that equality would destroy the natural and time-honored agencies by which values were passed on from one generation to another. Hierarchy was necessary in the family, the church, and the state, without which social stability was impossible. Thus, tradition, authority, status, cohesion, adjustment, function, norm, symbol, ritual were the elements that constituted a renewed interest in social order. And we see an interesting shift compared to the 18th century. That shift in interest is from the individual to the group. Conflict between tradition and modernity, crisis that gripped the old order, the loss of the old order and the birth pangs of the new order, social reorganization, and a quest for solidarity were at the heart of sociological concerns in the 19th century. Robert Nisbet says, and we quote him, "Sociology, above any other scholarly discipline, has taken the conflicts between traditionalism and modernism in European culture and converted them into a set of analytical and interpretative concepts." We, as we already mentioned, are going to focus on Saint-Simon and his industrial society. Why we are going to do is because he had a great influence on whom we credit as the first founder of sociology, Auguste Comte, and also on Emile Durkheim and Karl Marx. Saint-Simon was the founder of positive philosophy and the concept of industrial society. He analyzed the events leading from the 16th to the 18th centuries as the forces that began maturing in the old medieval order and which finally led to that order's demise. What were those? The growth of science, the emergence of the bourgeoisie, the Protestant Reformation, and the negative critical Enlightenment. Saint-Simon argued that Enlightenment contributed to the destruction of the old order, but failed to give principles that could aid in the reconstruction of society. So Saint-Simon endeavored to develop a philosophy that would be positive and constructive in nature. He emphasized that human knowledge had passed through the three stages of theological, metaphysical, and the contemporary positive stage. And thus, although Saint-Simon was heavily influenced by Bonald and Maistre, two of the most well-known French philosophers of the reaction, Saint-Simon recognized that there could be no going back to the old medieval order. He asserted that the new social unity should be made to rest on the unity of intellectual principles and hence the need for positive philosophy and knowledge. Here we provide a brief summary of Saint-Simon's ideas and we shall develop them later. Saint-Simon defined society as an organic unity. He asserted that the study of human behavior must be modeled firmly as a positive science and thus become scientific. Scientific knowledge will take the place of religious dogma. Scientists and industrialists would take the place of the old medieval elite, and they will lead the new positive industrial society. Now we go into the details of Saint-Simon's sociology. Saint-Simon saw an essential relation between property and power, and he argued that political institutions must be the expression of the society itself. He saw and believed that society could and should be organized along scientific positive principles with the economic and political systems working in harmony with each other. He believed that science was positive and therefore through its principles and verifications they formed the basis of practice in industrial society. Saint-Simon argued that society that was coming into being, that is positive society, was dominated by the centrality of science. This made possible the growth of systematic social knowledge and the discovery of laws that regulated the social whole. Saint-Simon's model of society was therefore in sharp contrast to Enlightenment thought, and it was holistic in nature. Saint-Simon conceived a healthy society as one where its parts and subparts were in necessary harmony with the social whole. We again see the influence of the philosophy of the reaction here. Social health was intimately linked with production and the role of the productive classes. And here we run into a little bit of problem with regard to Saint-Simon's analysis of class. He did not provide us with a theory of class, and we'll see why. Making a distinction between idlers and productive classes, Saint-Simon placed bankers, industrialists, managers, scientists, and the manual workers, the workers whom Marx would label as the proletariat, manual workers, in the same group of the productive classes. He assumed that all those who formed these productive classes held a common interest. So therefore, the interests of the bankers and industrialists and managers and scientists were compatible with the interests of the manual workers. His understanding of the productive classes was later and quite legitimately called by Marx as naive. Further, in his explanation of the new society, the class structure and institution of private property are left more or less intact. So Sassimo did not want a disruption of that. Sassimo's early works on economics reflected his laissez-faire position, but his position diverges in significant respects from those of the classical economists. Production for him was not an end in itself. Rather, it was a means through which the conditions of life could be improved. Production for improvement of conditions of life could be made possible through planning, rational planning of production in the new industrial society, and he outlined this form of rational planning through an industrial parliament or planning body that would be constituted of industrialists, scientists, artists, and engineers. Sassimo disagreed with the assumption of the classical economists that utilitarianism or the pursuit of individual well-being will lead automatically for the general good. He pointed out that the unbridled egoism of the rich as well as the uncurbed rebelliousness of the poor will lead to disorganizing consequences in the absence of a worldly ethic of a new kind. He asserted that the new positive society would need a secular equivalent of religion, and we would see the direct link here, the influence that Sassimo had not only on Comte but also on Durkheim. Sassimo's industrial society would become a vast workshop that would be organized around the production of goods, where the authority over the population would turn into authority over things. So he's referring to the old order and saying what would be in the new order. The authority would turn over things instead of over population. Sassimo did not argue for the abolition of political institutions. Instead, he argued for decision-making to be increasingly devolved unto the institutions associated with science and technology. Politics, he says, does not express the goodwill, but an equilibrium subsisting between economic and political structures. Sassimo described industrial society in terms of collaboration and consensus. Under the old system, force constituted the means of social cohesion. But industrial society, Sassimo argued, would create partners, not subjects, and would be associated modes of cooperation involving laborers and the wealthiest property owners. The principles of free production, Sassimo argued, would generate moral solidarity. Sassimo emphasized the necessity of improving the condition of the poorest classes and of founding the industrial system on the principle of fraternity. Evidently, Sassimo's theory was one of the rising bourgeoisie. He emphasized on the inevitable class struggle between the rising industrial classes and the old feudal classes. However, unlike Marx, Sassimo could not imagine that the bourgeoisie could be superseded by the working class or the proletariat. Zeitlin says it was unthinkable on the part of Sassimo. The ideal for Sassimo was the spiritual elite of the Middle Ages. Hence, Sassimo could not conceive of a society governed by anyone other than an educated elite. He believed that the scientists and industrialists were natural leaders of the working class. Scientists were associated with the spiritual realm and industrialists were associated with the temporal realm. Artists were to contribute to the moral unity of society by shaping beliefs, opinions, and sentiments. He did foresee conflict between owners and non-owners, but he believed that this conflict could and should be averted in a truly organic society. Sassimo argued that the main purpose of politics was to preserve property. He further asserted that the only barrier which the property owners can put up against the proletariat is a system of ethics. Comte, who was an apprentice of Sassimo, had upheld these views and developed further the positive philosophy of Sassimo. As we may see, the problems of inequality and justice were problems that bothered Durkheim, who wrote extensively on social justice, the abnormal and pathological forms of modern division of labor, and the need for social solidarity based on organic principles. For Sasimo, it was industry that, by embracing all forms of useful work, alone was capable of producing values that would bind modern society into an organic whole. For him, industry has ushered in a new era that signaled the end of government that was marked by force in favor of administrative power that favored consultation and consensus. Sasimo was also aware that post-revolutionary Europe was still dominated by critical thought of the Enlightenment, and therefore it was failing to adopt the organizational character of society. A disjunction thus existed between the institutions of industrialism and the broader culture. Social regulation became an acute problem in modern society because it came through the destabilization of the old society and through the forces of revolution. So long as the state and civil society were inseparable, and so long there were traditional values and institutions that regulated that order, the problem of regulation was not acute. But with the separation of civil society and state, the destabilizing of older forms of authority, values and institutions, social regulation became an acute problem, and therefore there arose a moral vacuum in society which Sasimo sought to confront with what he called his new Christianity. He stood against the classical economist's position that the market provided the moral glue for the new society. Instead, Sasimo argued that the free play of economic forces alone would never bring integrity, stability, and moral regulation. Industrial society required a strong moral center, and a secular religion was to be that center from which regulation would flow. This new Christianity was opposed to the egoism of individualism. The new Christianity would function through a priesthood of artists, scientists, and industrial leaders whose interests, he thought, were identical with those of the masses. Sasimo's image of industrial society was one of cooperative enterprise. He, however, defined it in terms of a system organized around the principles of functional hierarchy, rational discipline, and selective leadership. Industrial society was not a communist utopia, but a hierarchical structure which had produced a new governing class of scientists and industrialists. Social regulation was thus a process that was directed from above by the industrial educated elite. For Sasimo, then, knowledge was the moving power of progress as well as the binding force of society. And we will see how this had a tremendous impact on Comte and his theories. Sasimo believed that the human science, modeled along the lines of the natural sciences, was the only science that was capable of reconciling the different interests of classes. It could thus serve as the foundation for a unified organic society. Sasimo's developmental view of history is one that passed through 3 stages and a secular ethic. All these had a great influence in Comte's law of 3 stages and positive philosophy. A secular religion replacing the old Catholic one also had a considerable influence on Durkheim, besides the problem of industrial society that Sasimo dealt with. So here, in discussing Sasimo, we had taken extensively from Alan Swingewood's A Short History of Sociological Thought, Irving Zeitlin's Ideology and Development of Sociological Theory, from Raymond Aron's Main Currents, and also from Robert Nisbet's The Sociological Tradition. Thank you.